Hey folks, welcome everyone to the Continuous Testing Meetup, our online format. We're very happy to have you here. Thank you for saving some time from your day to spend it with us. Listen to our speaker today, Dennis, and I hope you get something valuable, interesting from this talk. Um, First of all, we would like to thank all of our sponsors. So Trendig, TUI, and Sauce Labs, they basically give us time to spend time here, with you all, the community. They also help us with the different, small payments we have to do for the Zoom account, for the Meetup account, and different things like that. But also we want to thank people who are volunteers like Arlene and Severin who are here today, and some others who basically do this for the pure love of testing and the community as well. If you are wondering what other events are coming soon or have happened in the past, please head to continuoustestingmeetup.com. You will see there the different meetups we have had in the past, and most of them are getting recorded. So if you find one of them that looks interesting for you, or maybe one of your colleagues or friends, just go there, click on the link and share it to maybe your friends, colleagues, or maybe share it in LinkedIn because maybe you found something that was interesting for everyone else to check. So that's the invitation for you all. Go have a look, check what else has happened in our community, and share it with the rest of the ecosystem. Today we have Dennis Martinez. Dennis is joining us from Japan, so it's very late for him, but we're super thankful that taking the time to share with us a great story about how someone went from 0 to 2,000 automated tests. So the startup world moves pretty fast, and then it's going to share with us the story about how they were able to achieve this in this quick and a bit crazy world of the startups. One little thing for you all, the folks who are listening to this talk, if you have questions, please write them down in the chat. We're going to collect them at the end. And at the end, feel free to, unmute yourself and then ask the question or just write it there. Next to that, it's always nice to see faces when you are giving a talk remotely. So if you are not shy, if it's okay with you, please turn on your camera so people can see you, that you are there. And also, please be respectful with the speaker. This Zoom format, like, you have all the rights to unmute yourself and to turn on your camera, but during the talk, please mute yourself so the speaker can concentrate on what they want to share with us. Having said all that, I think it's time for Dennis to join us. So Dennis, thank you for being here. Thank you for speaking at the Continuous Testing Meetup. And yeah, like, the stage is yours. Thank you for being here.
All right. Thank you for the quick introduction, and I do appreciate being here as well and having been invited. Just giving my talk here, so I'll share my screen so I can begin. So, as Diego mentioned, my talk is titled "Going from 0 to 2,000 Automated Tests at a Startup." So, just a little brief introduction about myself. My name is Dennis Martinez. I'm a freelance software engineer. I'm currently specializing in automated testing and DevOps. You may have seen some of my articles from the Dev Tester website. Some of my articles have been shared in some of the newsletters that have been around for software testing. So you might have read one or two of my articles before. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, but I've lived in New York City and San Francisco before I arrived to Osaka, Japan, where it's 2 in the morning right now on Thursday. So I've been here for 9 years now, and I've been working remotely for companies all over the globe. I've worked with startups pretty much exclusively for the last 20 years, and I've seen the good, I've seen the bad, and I've seen the ugly, which occurs in these environments. So that's kind of where this story begins. So my story begins a few years ago where I was hired at a pre-launch startup that had been developing an online platform for a niche in their local market. At the time, the startup had spent about 7 months in stealth mode, building the application, building the MVP for their application. The founders weren't developers themselves. One was a business person, the other one was more of a designer. So they hired freelancers like myself to build on this project. The tech team when I started consisted of only one backend engineer and one front-end engineer, so it was a really tiny crew. And that crew would be a lot smaller because the reason I was brought in was I would be replacing the existing backend engineer who was leaving in just a few weeks after I started. So when I joined the startup, they were 1 month away from their scheduled beta launch, and I was brought in to help push it past that initial finish line. And as you can imagine, it was a really, really stressful time with everyone running around and trying to finish what was needed to get the site up and running. So the first time I used the app, it was the pure definition of an MVP project. It had really little in the way of advanced functionality, and it only covered the basics to get the platform up and running, and with a few features here and there to start attracting new people to the platform. So since the app was in such a basic initial state, I was wondering why did it take 7 months for the app to get to the state where it was? Because I've worked with startups that have done a lot more with less resources and less people. So on the surface, my initial assessment was that it probably shouldn't have taken that long to reach the current state where it was. So when I opened the code base for the first time, this is kind of what I found underneath the surface. I can see why the development pace was a bit slow for this, but I began wondering why it had gotten to this state. So my initial hunch was that this could have been for a lack of quality freelancers, which is usually a risk for early stage startups, especially those that don't have technical founders, because they don't really understand what skills they need to hire for, and they usually look for the cheapest solution, which ends up being a lot more expensive in the long run because it ends up with code bases that are barely holding it together. So, but after interacting with the team and learning how they were working and their existing workflow, I figured out the reason why the app wasn't in this state. It really wasn't because they didn't have quality freelancers, but it was mostly because of the team's QA processes at the time. So being a software engineer, my first focus was to see what kind of test automation was in place and see how that was all set up. So one of the first things I often do when joining a team to work on an existing application is to figure out how to run the automated tests, which gives me uh, a little bit more confidence and more context around the business logic implemented so far in the application. And it allows me to work on the code with a lot more confidence. Of course, when I opened the folder where the test for the application should be, I was greeted with a single file that contained less than a dozen automated test cases. And of course, when I ran the tests, every single one of them failed. None of them worked. So I asked the other backend engineer on the project about these tests, and this is how our Slack conversation kind of went. As someone who's worked with startups through my entire career, I know that automated testing is usually way, way low on the list of things to do, especially during those hectic months just before the launch of a new product. Things change really, really fast. What was decided yesterday to be added to the app could completely change today and be something entirely different. And trying to maintain automated tests in that environment can be more of a distraction than a help, at least at the beginning. However, the problem isn't that there weren't any automated tests. The real problem is that the app in its current state was really, really broken. The app's happy path was fine if I went through the main flows of the application and as the business had intended to do, there wouldn't be any issues whatsoever. But we all know that the real world doesn't treat your application in a normal way. So on one of the first days on my job, I did some exploratory testing on the app at the start of my day just to start getting a better feel for the existing functionality and how everything worked. And by lunchtime, I already had a list of over a dozen bugs that I ran into, and I wasn't even trying. So while I was still familiarizing myself with the code base, I knew that many of these bugs would have been caught early by test automation and fixed pretty quickly. The other major problem that I noticed is that almost every change to the code base would add or fix one thing, but cause something completely unrelated to fail. So, for example, one of the first tasks I had as a developer involved fixing a bug in the user settings section of the application, where there was a weird issue where one of the fields wouldn't save any updates to the database. So it looked like a really simple fix to help me get comfortable with the code base, and I made the change, then pushed the commit to staging. It turned out that that commit completely broke the login functionality, which I never really expected because they seem to be two completely different areas of the application. And when I looked at the recent code commit history for the month prior to my arrival, it seems that this was something that was happening every single day. Over half of the code commits were fixing something that broke, and they weren't adding really any new functionality to the app. So, besides the lack of automated testing, the organization's testing processes at the time were also nearly non existent. Testing consisted of the engineering team deploying changes to a staging environment, then pinging a member from the business development team on Slack because there was really nobody else to do the testing, and asking them in extremely vague terms to test one section of the app whenever they had some free time. And this was a startup, so that meant that this person never really had any time to do any testing. The business development person who often did the manual testing did a really good job at reporting the areas that were broken, but they rarely explored outside of what they were asked to do. So combining this lack of exploratory testing with the person having a lot of other work on their plate, and it's no wonder why there were so many issues slipping through undetected. Unsurprisingly, bugs began to sneak into the code base at a seemingly exponential rate as the launch date crept closer and closer. And I was starting to fear that this would be a pretty disastrous debut for this startup. So it was just my first week, and things weren't looking very good. The app was fairly broken, there were no tests, and there was really low discipline around QA. And to top it off, the existing work that was completed in the application was in the heads of a freelancer who would be leaving soon. And as you may have guessed as well, there was almost no documentation for anything related to the code or testing or even the business itself. So in this situation, what was I to do? Like, well, I could have just done my development work and pushed the application out the door and get it launched to the public. I knew that this startup would have no chance of surviving if they spent most of their time post-launch on bug fixing instead of iterating and improving the app with real-world user feedback. So I determined that immediate action was necessary, and I had to start somewhere. So instead of brute forcing my way through establishing some kind of QA process and writing tons of automated tests, I first shifted my attention from software development work to test strategy. So, in my experience, projects with no automated tests usually means that no one really took the time to think about QA as part of the project. Often at startups, the teams feel pressure to deliver tangible, visible results, so they skip all sorts of testing because it really doesn't show those tangible results. Also, a pervasive mindset for smaller teams is that they'll defer testing for the future when they get some free time to dedicate to the cause. So they just think that in the future they'll have this block of time where they'll be able to sit down and backfill every single automated test that they had to do. But guess what? They never ever get that free time to get back to testing. At a small startup, you're always giving things to do. Free time for testing just won't suddenly drop on your lap or magically fall from the sky. So, if you're serious about improving the long term quality and health of your software project, you need to take the time for planning and strategy as early as possible. So one of the first things to do to know where you currently have deficiencies in the development and testing workflows is to just take a look at how things are going. At the startup I joined, I already saw a complete lack of testing processes. So I decided to spend a good chunk of my first week strategizing how to begin introducing test automation processes alongside the work I was hired to do, which was to finish building features and fixing bugs to launch the application. During the time, I also began getting a better understanding of the application's inner workings to know where the project would benefit the most from automated testing. In most projects, I noticed that you'll get the most benefit in test automation from just a handful of sections. So it's kind of like the Pareto principle applies here, where I estimate about 80% of the problems in an application come from about 20% of the code base. Almost all software applications I worked on have one or two areas that cause the majority of the reported issues in the project. Another thing I noticed is that most of the time, there's a direct correlation between the sections of the app that break the most and the messiest, nastiest parts of the code base. So there's a direct correlation between something that breaks a lot and just spaghetti code underneath the surface. So the next step was to implement the necessary tooling to get automated tests working, like installing libraries and setting up a continuous integration environment for running tests after every change to the code base. As I mentioned, the application for this startup had a few broken tests that use the application's framework's default testing libraries. Now, while I could have gone with what was already in place for my testing, I opted to start from scratch and implement what I knew would help build our testing processes. This helped set the foundation for building up an automated test suite that would help detect issues early and often, which the team never really had. One thing that helped me a lot in this area is that because this was a startup, I took advantage of being able to implement what I needed without having to go through meetings or getting buy-in from other people on the team. So that helped me establish the foundation pretty quickly for test automation. I realized that's something that most testers aren't lucky to have, but the message here is that if you have any advantage to help you with QA and your testing work, you need to take it. Once the project had tooling in place and a clear path on which areas to focus upon, it was pretty easy to get started with my first few automated tests alongside the development work I was doing. These set the tone for how the automated testing would become part of the development cycle instead of something that somebody on the team would probably maybe in the future do, which would meant that they would have never gotten to it. It also gave me and the rest of the team a quick win and something to look forward to keep expanding upon. I've noticed that it's one thing to talk about test automation in theory, but implementing it in a project and seeing real actual results makes it feel like something that you could continue to build upon. And it encourages the rest of the developers and testers to keep building upon that foundation. So my takeaway for this phase is pretty much just take the time to plan your automated testing strategy because it'll help you moving in the right direction a lot better and a lot faster than just diving in and trying to get things fixed pretty quickly. And by taking time, I usually mean making the time because otherwise it won't happen because I've been very guilty of jumping straight into the code first and writing tests and asking questions later, but it's usually better to analyze this situation because it'll save you a ton of time. So the next step was to figure out when do we write these automated tests. So most teams that begin their test automation journey often begin with a sudden blast of energy and enthusiasm, only to have that quickly evaporate when there are a thousand other things that they have to deal with. Then the test suite becomes obsolete and everything comes to a halt. So that seems to have been the case with the person who wrote those original dozen automated test cases that were not working. They apparently worked at some point, but apparently they were quickly neglected and they failed and nobody really bothered to fix them. Smaller teams and startups usually don't have dedicated testers or someone like a software development engineer in test who mainly focuses on setting up test automation and writing test cases. So the best way I found to tackle this problem is to make sure that testing is part of the team's completed work by including it in your definition of done. So you need to set a rule, whether for yourself or with your team, to ensure that any changes made to the code base have a corresponding test case. For the startup I joined, there was only one other backend engineer working on the project, and he was about to leave. So my plan was for any new feature or bug fix that I made on the project, I would at least have some automated test cases for it before I merged it in. It does take some discipline to follow this, especially when it's a self-imposed rule and you're working at a hectic, crazy startup. But it's really easy. It is really easy to forget your own rules when you have all this work piling up behind you. But once you build up the habit, I found that it's a lot easier to follow this rule no matter what's happening around you. Now, you can rely on yourself to always include tests with any new work, but what about when you work with a team and other people? So, as I mentioned at the start, there were only two other developers on the team, but soon after the startup officially launched, the engineering team expanded to a few more developers to help build the app. While I knew that I should add automated tests to help support my work, I really can't expect or force others to do the same. So when working on a team with other developers and testers, the best thing to do is to come to an agreement on making automated testing a part of the definition of done for any work. The way I helped establish this was through code reviews. Whenever I noticed a spot where it made sense to include automated test coverage, I would leave a comment and let the developer know about it. So at the beginning, it was pretty rough to do this. The developers hadn't really built that habit of writing automated tests with all their changes. And many developers really, in other places that they work, they really don't follow this either at all. Me being a developer first, more than a tester, I would say, I do see that developers do have that reputation of not really wanting to write any tests. So I was really constantly leaving comments on pull requests because they didn't have any tests when I thought they should have. And it didn't make me the most popular person with my coworkers, as seen by this picture that somebody drew on an office whiteboard one day at another startup that I worked on. But that's really the price one has to pay for a better product at the end of the day, or at least that's what I told myself. Over time, the code reviews did help, and the developers began to include more automated tests with their changes. And it was probably because they wanted to avoid me leaving comments saying, "Where are the tests?" But whatever the reason was, it really led to fewer regressions and it encouraged the team to get into the habit of writing automated tests and building a strong testing culture in the organization. Now, that doesn't mean that absolutely every single change to a code base must have tests. You also have to be pragmatic and know when and where it makes sense to do test automation. We all have moments where we can't absolutely spare any time to do anything for testing for various reasons. Like you have a hard deadline that you really, really can't skip. Other tests, they aren't worth the time and effort to spend development time on because it takes more effort to automate them than to test them manually. So every situation is different, and knowing when not to automate your testing is just as equally beneficial as knowing when automation is necessary and helpful. So my takeaway for this phase is to make automated testing a part of the development process and just know when it makes sense to do it. And also try to remind other people on your teams to do it, even if it makes you the least popular person on the team. Uh, About a month into the product launch, the automated test suite began to expand, and we went from a dozen completely broken test cases to about 200 automated tests that covered around 85% of the most critical sections of the app, mostly in the form of unit and functional tests. It was still a far cry from where I wanted to be, but the application was a lot more stable, and we were able to get much farther along in our development work than if I hadn't taken the time to plan and help the team implement these tests while doing our expected work. While I continue adding more automated test cases along with my regular task, the team began to have some places that were making our testing processes a bit inefficient and slowing us down a bit. And it was mostly because as a startup with limited funds, we tried to do everything related to testing without spending any money at all. In these cases, you'll need to figure out when spending some money is faster and cheaper than trying to deal with these issues on your own. Being a startup, most of the tools that we were using around testing were completely free. Nowadays, it's super easy and it's easier than ever to build a fully fledged automated test suite without spending a single penny outside of your development costs, thanks to open source and other free tools that are available. For startups that have a limited budget, these tools and services, they're very, very attractive, but they do have their trade-offs, like subpar performance or missing functionality or usage limits. And although the tools don't cost a penny to use, there are a lot of other hidden costs involved in the process that aren't clear up front, like needing to spend countless hours setting things up or solving problems because there's no customer support for these tools. Now, there have been countless times that I've worked on teams that they adopt a free open source tool because they want to avoid spending $50 a month, only to have them spend thousands of dollars in engineering time to fix and maintain the tools themselves. So if you know that a paid solution will help you save money in the long run, just do it. Otherwise, it's going to be like pulling teeth. You're going to get the result you're looking for, but it's not going to be a pleasant process. So the first place to look when investing in money to when investing money to help support your testing efforts is with the tooling that you use that you'll use for the application. At this startup, the main issue we encountered as our test suite grew was with slow and flaky test runs with our continuous integration service. My suspect at the time was the service that we use, which is GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions, for those who don't know, is a continuous integration service that comes integrated with GitHub, which was our main code repository. While GitHub Actions works great, and more importantly for the startup, it's mostly free depending on the usage. It runs on low-powered hardware, and it creates some problems that rarely surface on our very powerful development machines. The other problem that I had is that with GitHub Actions, if something fails, it's almost impossible to debug why it's failing. Basically, you just need to make commits, and it's kind of like just guessing what's wrong with the process, and it's really time consuming and really tedious and annoying. So, but despite these challenges, the startup continued using GitHub Actions because we weren't charged for our usage at all. So that's what we went with. But I knew that this would hamper our testing efforts, and it might even reach the point where the team would give up on using it. So I began to proactively look at some alternatives. Um, in the past, I'd used some paid continuous integration services that offered higher performance, more reliable test runners, and make it easy to debug the pipeline locally. So I recommended one of these to the company, and they were super hesitant to pay for it because up to now, everything was free for them, and it didn't make sense for them to pay for something that essentially they were getting for free elsewhere. But so I had to make the case that it would actually save them money in the long haul by having us developers and testers not have to waste time waiting for builds to pass or scratching our heads wondering why the build failed for no reason whatsoever. So the company eventually did agree to try it out for a few months. And after I made the switch, almost immediately, all our existing issues around continuous integration disappeared entirely. Our builds began to run about 30% faster, and the only failures that we got were legitimate ones. So it was yielding a lot of return on the investment. We had other areas as well where investing in tools yielded huge benefits, like with automated visual regression testing. The team could have spent a lot of time figuring out how to improve test runs, to fix the continuous integration issues, or how to better catch visual regressions, but it still wouldn't fix the problem as the application grew. So better tools can definitely resolve these issues immediately. But investing money in tools and services isn't really the only way to get the most out of your money in any organization. A good investment can also come in the form of people, like hiring new team members or bringing in a consultant or freelancer to get you up and running quickly and efficiently. Of course, paying a tester's salary or getting a high price consultant isn't something that would happen very often, but it can make a huge return on that investment if you do it right. So, as an example, earlier this year, a company hired me to spend a week with them to get their test automation setup running as efficiently as possible because the team had done a lot of work trying to do this, but they had spent weeks trying to get things running well, but they weren't getting the results that they wanted. So I was able to helped them get to the point where they were very happy with the automated testing processes and the results they were getting. And the CTO of the company later told me that my involvement actually saved them a ton of time and money in the long term because I was able to get what they wanted pretty quickly, and they were able to take it from then on out, compared to them spending many months on more than one or two software engineers or testers to get everything working correctly. But companies don't always have to hire people either to get the help they need when it comes to automated testing. A lot of organizations, especially startups, have all the talent that they need in-house. Uh, so all these people, like all those people that you have, the only thing they really need is the opportunity and the time to be able to do the work. So investing in books, online courses, in-person workshops, and conferences are all really good investments in your team's growth. More often than not, this not only benefits the employee, but it also benefits the team a lot more. And I know there's a lot of free content out there on the internet, but consider investing in your education, even if your employer won't, because you'll always get a lot more out of it than what you pay for it. So my takeaway for this phase is that don't always go for the free or cheap route, because paying for tools and people will often save you a lot of time and frustration in the long haul. So in Spanish-speaking countries, and I'm sure most other cultures have similar phrases, we have an expression that says, "What's cheap turns out to be very expensive." So in test automation, I found that that's the same. So a few months in, I had established a pretty solid test automation process at the startup. The team continued to add tests, and we continued to see increasing value in them by helping us detect issues early and often. However, there was still some room for improvement. Given the fast-paced nature of a startup, our code base evolved rapidly over that time, and I found that some of our automated tests either didn't serve a purpose anymore, or they could be refactored and improved. Almost every single software project has these small tasks and enhancements that everyone wants to address, but they're not high priority enough to schedule during a sprint or an iteration in your company. And unfortunately, testing related tasks often fall into this category, and they're often placed on a backlog somewhere where they're often lost forever. So I found that one of the best ways to address these issues is to use your downtime during the work week. Now, I'm sure that as soon as I said that, a lot of you probably thought, well, that's easy for you to say. I don't have absolutely any time, any downtime at work. So that's what I thought too, especially working at a startup and seeing the pile of tickets in our project management system that were waiting for me. However, I realized that I had a lot more time to tackle these tasks than I thought. We all have pockets of spare time to do some test related activities during work, whether it's because you're waiting to be unblocked by someone on the team, or a meeting was miraculously canceled, or because you're waiting for your super slow end to end test to finish running, which I'm sure happens to everyone here. So the only way you could really know how much free time you have is to keep track of them, of all these moments whenever they pop up. I challenge anyone who says that they don't have absolutely any downtime to keep track of what they do daily for at least a week or two. Most of the time, you'll realize that you have a lot more pockets of free time available than you expect. And these are the best moments you have to improve testing for your projects, because these are the moments when no one's really expecting you to be doing something urgent. For instance, the startup for the story had a bi-weekly deployment cadence. We didn't strictly adhere to Agile, Scrum, or any other methodology, but we did have scoping sessions to work on a set of issues every 2 weeks and then deploy those changes to production. And this schedule often left developers with about a day or two before the next deployment date for QA and handling any unforeseen issues that we might have encountered during the sprint. So this often meant that I would not have a lot to do between the end of one of these deployment phases until the next scoping session. And that left me with plenty of time to address some of the automated testing issues that we had. And while I did know that the end of one of these sprints was a little bit slower for me when it came to how much work I had to do, I never really realized how much slower it was until I paid closer attention to the end of these cycles. And it turned out that on average, I had about a full workday every single week with nothing scheduled. So, because the development schedule never really explicitly set testing related functionality for us to work on, I began using this time now that I knew that I had it to address any testing issues that I knew about. One of the most efficient uses of this downtime is to work on some of the smaller issues that the team wanted to address during a normal workday, but they weren't really that important enough to drop everything to address on the spot. Every development and testing team I worked with has a never-ending laundry list of issues in their backlog that seems to keep accumulating until somebody does something about it. Working on these small tasks might seem insignificant, but every little bit helps. And these tiny changes often lead to big results, like the small steps that I took for the startup to go from 0 tests to eventually over 2,000 automated tests. Some examples of these small tasks that you can do during your downtime is to prune the automated test suite or fixing slow and flaky tests that need to run more efficiently because they're just slowing everything down. Another tip I have during your downtime is to see if you have a team member that you could pair up with, which can help you move a lot quicker and make these tasks a whole lot more fun. One example that comes to mind was when I had a day with little work to do, and I noticed one of the front end engineers also didn't have anything to do that day. So we paired together and to get some automated testing libraries updated on the front end. The few tests that we had for the front end were working and they were perfectly functional. So there was really no sense of urgency for us to drop what we were doing to make these updates. But we did know that the newer versions of these libraries had some new enhancements that would help the existing front-end testing processes. So in a few hours, we were able to pair and complete these updates and even refactored some of the tests to take advantage of the new functionality. So it was a huge win for everyone. And this was something that we wouldn't have done if I didn't notice that our days were pretty much clear to work on this because we didn't have anything scheduled. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have never gotten around to doing these updates. Uh, You don't have to really spend all your downtime handling existing issues, though. It's equally important to always be on the lookout for new and better ways to help your existing testing processes. Sometimes we could focus way too much on tweaking and expanding the things that we already have to make them just perfect, that we often forget to identify additional ways to make the product better. So for the startup I was working with, I often took these longer stretches of downtime to introduce new testing processes into the mix. One example was adding static code analysis as part of our development process. So anytime a developer or tester made a change to the code base, our continuous integration service would run static code analysis to make sure that our code remained consistent and we didn't accidentally introduce any potential vulnerabilities or errors. This was a very small change that took me about an hour to set up, but it did save the team countless hours by catching more issues early and reducing the time we spent on code reviews. If you're a developer, you know that code reviews sometimes can be a little nitpicky, where just because there's no white space or just some small issue just blocks everything and makes the whole process a lot slower. So this really helped a lot. Another change I introduced during this free time was performance testing. We had often received complaints for customers that one section of the application was pretty sluggish. And anytime we would make changes that seemed to speed things up, it inevitably regressed because we never kept track of performance. It wasn't something that was high up on the list of priorities for us. So I implemented some lightweight performance testing during one of these stretches of downtime so we could have some hard data on how some of the critical areas of the application perform. And we also began tracking them a lot more frequently so we could see when things were starting to slow down and make gradual improvements. Over time, this change helped us make API response times a lot faster, in some cases over 250% faster, and we could also easily detect any performance regressions before we shipped any new functionality to production. So the takeaway for this one is pretty much no one is busy 100% of the time. So just try to find some space to address these smaller issues that you have and to introduce any new improvements that you have, like performance testing. So you're able to just continue to improve on the process. So in a little under a year, about 10 or 11 months since I started working at this startup, I felt that we had a really strong testing culture at this startup. At this point, we had already grown past the 2,000 automated test cases, and each engineer on the team would frequently contribute to the test suite as part of their work. So while things were a lot better than where we started, I did notice that there was a lot less enthusiasm around the testing work that we did. One of the realities of building test automation and software development in general is that it seems like it's a never-ending grind. No matter how much time you spend on it, there's always going to be something to test, something to fix, something to improve upon. So at times you might even start asking yourself if what you're doing is worth the effort and if you should continue dedicating time and effort to build this robust testing environment that you want for your applications. Now, this can be a really dangerous attitude to foster because it could burn out the team pretty quickly and it could make your testing processes slowly deteriorate over time. One of the better ways I found to overcome this is to keep track of progress and celebrate the wins. It's really, really easy to forget to do this when your head's down in work at a startup, but it's really important to keep that energy and enthusiasm going. Something that works great for me and seems to work equally well with others is goal setting. When I began working at this startup and there were no automated tests, I set up personal milestones to motivate myself with what I was doing. So I first started small by establishing a goal to set up testing libraries for the project. And when I achieved that goal, I set up another goal to write at least 10 unit tests for the existing tasks that I was working with at the time. And I followed that up by setting up a timeline for implementing continuous integration and so on and so on. And as time went on, I kept adding small challenges for myself, like hitting the next 100 unit tests in the back end, reaching 80% code coverage for the automated test suite, and establishing service level objectives for critical API points to stay under a specific response time after I introduced performance testing into the project. And every time I set one of these goals, it gave me the fuel to keep that fire burning. And it gave me something to keep track of. So I knew that my work had a positive effect on the project. Without these goals and without me tracking them, I would probably have felt directionless and likely feel that my work wasn't helping the project too much. So keeping myself motivated helped me stick with implementing these automated tests, but I also knew that I needed the help of others to achieve any goals that I set out for myself. So you really can't force people to do things that they don't feel like doing. But one clever way that I found to get the team involved was to keep track of metrics and make them visible. There's something about sharing numbers that gets others more involved in the process and makes them really want to contribute. As far as metrics go, everyone's process of measuring their testing efficiency will vary wildly from team to team. For some teams, it's going to be the number of test cases or the test runs that they complete during a period of time. For others, it's keeping track of the number of bugs they find week over week. In my case, it was mainly test coverage and tracking how many defects slip through into production. So you need to find what works best for you, knowing that the importance of these numbers that you track will probably change over time. For instance, when I initially began implementing test automation for this project, I kept track of the number of automated tests we had, like unit tests, end-to-end tests, and so on. Knowing how many tests we had helped us focus on building something from scratch. Later, when more developers joined the team, I would start keeping track of how many defects were reported in production and started sharing them during our team meetings. It helped the rest of the team to see how all of our testing work was affecting the product. And we celebrated these wins together because it was a team effort. The hidden benefit behind tracking these numbers is that it really motivated everyone to help maintain and improve those numbers, even though it wasn't an explicit task that we had for them. we all wanted to keep the number of bugs low, for example. So especially after how bad things were before we actually launched the startup. So anytime they saw the number of defects increase for a sprint, you would see people start taking action to begin reducing those issues, even though they weren't told to actually work on those things. So there was a bit of a psychological effect when sharing these numbers, and I found that it was really helpful for the team. However, the purpose of setting measurable goals and keeping track of these metrics wasn't really to make myself or the team look good, or to boast about the progress that we made, or just to find something to celebrate and have fun with. In reality, most metrics and most of these numbers and personal challenges on their own, they aren't really particularly valuable. And without any significant context or meaning behind them, they really don't have a lot of information to provide. But my purpose for setting these challenges and tracking the metrics was to remind everyone, including myself, how far we've come. So when you're deep in the work, especially at a startup where you have so many things to do, you'll likely forget where you started from. It can feel like all the hours that you spent haven't really led to a lot of progress. So that's why keeping track of where you started and where you are in the present is really invaluable, because it's evidence that your work is piling up and accumulating and that your work really matters. So, in my opinion, there's really no stronger motivator to keep you going with test automation, knowing where you started from, seeing where you're at now, and realizing that your work is helping the entire team and the entire organization deliver a high quality product faster than ever. So my takeaway for this last phase pretty much is to never underestimate the power of motivation when working on test automation. And this really doesn't just apply to test automation. It applies in pretty much anything you do at work as well. So always try to find ways to keep yourself motivated and enthusiastic about the things that you do. So by the time I wrapped up my engagement with this startup, they had a really solid testing foundation in place and a really, really strong testing culture throughout the entire engineering team. While the work that I started helped achieve this, and getting from 0 to 2,000 automated test cases is a massive, massive feat, there was still plenty of room for improvement by the time I left. One area that I didn't get a chance to improve upon during my time there was to further diversify the type of automated tests that we had built. The bulk of the automated test suite, so about 90% of it, were mostly consisted of unit and functional tests. The remaining 10% or so were spread across static code analysis, a handful of end-to-end tests, and some performance tests. So having a large portion of unit and functional tests really help improve quality in the application, but it does leave a ton of gaps to fill. If I had been given the chance to work on this project again and focus solely on test automation, I would spend my time expanding on the performance and load testing that we had, because we already started seeing signs of some performance issues for our infrastructure as more users started to join the platform. I would also want to introduce other forms of testing like automated security testing, localization testing, because it was a multilingual website, and do other things like introduce feature flags or canary testing to help roll out the changes gradually and give us a little bit more time to test things out. However, I would probably place my energy the most on end-to-end testing because we barely had any, and the ones that we had didn't really cover the most critical parts of the app or most of the newer functionality in the app. And one of the reasons for this was because we lacked sufficient front-end testing experience. So our application consisted at the time of separate backend and front-end code bases, and me being mostly a backend engineer, most of my focus was placed on that side of the equation, which is why we had a pretty good test coverage on the back end, but very little on the front end. So the front end engineers that worked on the project didn't really have a lot of hands-on experience at their previous work building automated tests, so they rarely did. And while I could have stepped in to add more automated test scenarios and cover those gaps that we had, it really wouldn't have helped the rest of the team, who would have to continue adding and maintaining the front end test suite long after I left. So I would want to take more time to help developers who didn't feel confident in their automated testing skills and kind of serve as a guide, kind of like a guide to help them improve the quality of their work. One of the most rewarding experiences that I've had in my career was having the opportunity to spend a couple weeks pairing with a tester who only had manual testing experience, but he was really interested in helping with the automated testing side of things. So we spent a few hours a week during the work week creating new automated tests for the project at the time, with him mostly driving the sessions and me just providing some advice and some guidance. And he was able to understand enough quickly to create end-to-end tests on his own, which really helped improve that project. And his skills continue to develop from there. And I believe he's still working at that company now as a lead QA engineer. So I'm really, really happy that I played a very tiny part into that. And if I had the time at the startup that I gave for the story, if I were to work with them again, I would definitely carve out some more time for doing this type of coaching. Finally, one area that I would have loved to explore more is with continuous delivery. And while not many people think that continuous delivery is a part of QA, the focus of a continuous delivery pipeline is to have the ability to build and deliver software fast. And really, the only way you could achieve that is with solid automated testing processes in place. At this startup, deployments were always considered risky because our testing processes weren't still fully established. We still didn't have a lot of dedicated time to do manual exploratory testing, and the kind of testing still happened ad hoc, like I mentioned at the beginning of the story, where a developer would go on Slack and ping the rest of the team to test some new functionality just before deployment. And that really won't work if you want to deploy fast. In addition, our automated testing, well, also wasn't completely trustworthy because there were still a lot of gaps, as I just mentioned, with very few end-to-end tests and other types of testing. So while I believe that if we had set a goal for continuous delivery, where we could deploy a stable version of the application at any time or even completely automate the process, it would have made the testing processes a lot more better than they actually were. So anyway, the key here is that even though we were in a much, much better state when it came to QA and testing, you'll always have time to improve and find ways to make everything, the product a lot better. So to kind of recap this journey from going from 0 to 2,000 automated tests, the steps or phases that I took were pretty much taking the time to plan an automated testing strategy, which helped me and the rest of the team move in the right direction, making automated testing a part of the development workflow when it made sense, investing in tooling and services that help make the testing process easier, using downtime effectively to tackle these small issues and make improvements, and keeping myself and the rest of the team motivated by showing the positive effects of our work. Now, I wanted to close out this story with a quote credited to Nobel Peace Prize winner Desmond Tutu that you probably all have heard plenty of times before. And that's there is only one way to eat an elephant, a bite at a time. So my interpretation of this quote is that anything that seems impossible can become possible if you take the things one step at a time, no matter how long it takes, as long as you're consistent. So when it comes to automated testing in an existing software project with little or nothing in place, it may seem impossible to start testing or maintain a test suite without dedicating tons of time to it. However, if you take a bite at a time, so in this case would be coming up with a plan for testing, setting up the infrastructure, getting others involved, and so on, that seemingly hopeless task of having solid test automation will eventually become a reality over time. And it's not an easy road to take, especially if there's little support or interest in automated testing at the organization, but it is doable, as I hope I demonstrated during my talk. And that brings me to the end of the story. So I hope that my journey can help other developers and testers on their own paths towards test automation and high quality applications. If you want to connect with me outside of this meetup, feel free to reach out online at any of these places on this slide. I'd really love to hear from every one of you about anything related to testing, development, or whatever I can help with. And thanks a whole lot for spending this time with me today. I really, truly appreciate it.
Thank you, Dennis. Amazing talk. There have not been any questions so far, but if you have any, feel free to unmute yourself, or if you do not have a microphone, you can write in the chat. If there aren't any questions yet, then I have
a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
Sure.
Let me show myself. I want to say first and foremost, thank you so much. This was an incredible session. An incredible session. Dennis, I know it's late in your part of the world, friend, but can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
First and foremost, I've been a fan of yours for so long, and so this was a great talk.
Thank you.
No, I said it, I meant it.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the piece about making your work visible, right? Dominica de Grandis says this a lot in her book. If you can't see your work, how can you manage it?
Yeah.
And for you, being solo and getting people to buy into software quality, how do you balance getting people excited by seeing progress and also not overloading them with information in terms of context?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a really tricky balance to have at times, because as you mentioned, you could overflow people with a lot of information that the numbers just completely seem meaningless in the end. I guess for myself, I think the best kind of like motivator for that there was to actually point out moments where the work that the people were doing was actually helping. So there's one example that comes to mind where um, one of the front end engineers wrote some end-to-end tests that maybe like 1 or 2 weeks later they actually caught some bugs before they went out to production. So I was the very first one to like raise my hand and said like, "Oh, you remember you wrote those tests? They helped save us, and this would have gone to production, and this would have been like, I probably made it a little bit bigger than it actually was. I probably would have said like, oh, like customers would have like left the platform and all these things, but my purpose was really to like make them see that the things that they're actually doing, like they have a real world impact. So anytime I saw the opportunity to point that out, I would actually do that first and foremost. And then as for giving information about like the metrics that we were following and things like that, I would try to keep it as simple as possible. Just a handful of things that were probably relevant for us at the moment. So, like I mentioned in the beginning, it was more about tracking the number of automated test cases that we had, and once we reached the point where that number really didn't mean a lot or wasn't going as up as quickly as it needed before, then I just shifted to other metrics. Like when I added performance testing, I would start talking about that, and just doing just brief moments here and there and keeping them visible. I would bring them up during our weekly meetings, but I would also we had a Notion page where I would just keep this information up to date as much as I could. And they knew where it was, so they really didn't need my constant reminders to keep telling them to look at those things. So that's kind of the way that uh I tried to handle this the most. But it was just mostly trying to show them where their work actually mattered, and like finding those moments and really pointing it out to them and pointing it out in public so that everybody could actually see the benefits of what we were doing, as well as software engineers and testers.
I love that so much. And Seb and Diego and everyone, I'm so sorry. I do have a follow-up question, and I promise I'll shut up right after this. Is that okay? I'll ask my MCs first. Is that okay?
Oh, for me, it's fine.
Go ahead. Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love that so much. So a follow-up question to that is, Pradeep Sanjaran, author of Buddha in Testing, he talks a lot about how testers don't always understand the business analysis.
Yeah.
And earlier you were talking about joining a startup, the founders, not being, that lack of understanding and how you help them. I'm curious for you, and I promise this is my final question, Your Honor. What advice would you give to other test automation developers like yourself that are in this situation that may feel like they are alone, they're solo testers, and they can blame, the product owners all the time around business requirements, not getting it, developers, silos, whatever. But what advice would you give for solo testers around how to really understand the business so that they can execute those solutions?
Yeah, that's that's a little bit more difficult to do at times because
Yeah,
I'm like remembering myself when I started like over 20 years ago and not really
yeah,
caring absolutely anything at all about the business. I just wanted to code. I just wanted to like
yeah.
just do things and
Mhm,
just do whatever changes that I had. So I think
mhm,
over time, most developers, especially people who work in like startups and things like that. So I think my perspective is probably a little skewed because I've worked only with startups my whole career, and I've never
mhm,
really worked in huge organizations or any place for that matter, like a medium-sized place or anything. So um but I guess in those situations you really for like larger companies you probably won't have this problem, but for startups it I guess it all depends on the business itself. So I've worked at startups where the product owners or like the founders, they're very kind of like tight-lipped over what they're doing, and
mhm,
they really just want bodies doing the work, and they really don't share a lot. The startup that I worked for this story, the founders were actually the opposite. They kind of overshared a little bit too much, I guess, at times. So
mhm,
it was a lot easier in that sense to know like the work that I was doing to help them launch the product. But as I mentioned as well in the beginning, like I knew that without this type of testing, they really wouldn't survive that long. And I think it's just
mhm,
mostly experience. So it's really difficult for me to answer that because I think a lot of it comes from experience. It comes from the business itself, like what they want to share and how open they are to accepting uh, this whole paradigm around, testing and how much it actually does help. Because very often, like this startup as well, they really didn't realize how much testing or automated testing could help them until they actually saw the actual results. Yeah, the final thing I was going to add to that was um, just being able to show your work and being able to find ways to show what you're doing, whether it's you're making you have like tangible evidence that your tests are, saving work, or they're reducing the time to for development, or making the application faster, or anything like that. Like any little small thing that you could grab onto to actually
yeah,
show that what you're doing is having a positive effect and you're not just like wasting money on time and money on doing this, then that would
mhm,
probably be the best advice that I would probably give. But over time, I think it just gets a lot easier over time, both
mhm.
in the places that you work at and with your own like working experience as well. So I that probably was a little bit of a cop out because I don't have
No,
like any
not at all.
tangible
Not at
advice,
all.
but but that's pretty much like what I would say. I think a lot of it is just like showing what you're doing is like what you're doing matters.
I love that. Thank you so much. And just like been a fan of yours for years. So thank you for being here up so late. But I'm gonna go back to the host. Thank you so much. This was brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mhm.
Perfect. All right. We have another question from Enrique. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello there. Congratulations, Dennis, for your talk. It was great.
Thank you.
I have a question. It wasn't really clear to me if you could say a little bit more about your strategy to convince the other developers at first, for example, as understood from your experience in that experience, specific experience, the other guys wasn't really interested in testing. It was not just the thing that they didn't have the time or they didn't have the approval by the company to use time by that. They were just not interested in that. And I can see that from my own experience. Usually, if the developers are not interested, they can have all the time in the world. They will find reasons to not do the testing and uh, uh, to bypass it somehow. So my question is, like, how do you convince them at first? Okay, you can have the measures and you can have the celebration about when they are already doing it. But the first moment when they are not doing it all and they having all the excuses in the world to not do it, how do you get it from the zero to something, the first bite on the elephant? Because for me, as the way I see it, it's the hardest one, right?
It is.
Yeah.
It is, yeah. That's been my experience as well. In the past, I've had a lot of coworkers who, no matter what you did, it was very like almost impossible to get them doing anything. I think you're gonna have some developers who are simply not gonna do it just because they just don't see the value in it. And I think it's just mostly most of the times where I've had that success where I've been able to I guess convince, it's not really convincing, it's just showing them the benefits of the work. So when I've been successful doing that, it's just because they've seen how something that either they did or something that I did actually made their work a lot easier. So if there's a way that you could find that you could demonstrate that adding a test here or doing something would actually like save them time or benefit, like that actually helps a lot because most of these developers, the ones who don't really have a lot of I guess hands-on experience or no interest, it's usually because they really haven't been someplace that has people like myself who are constantly like bothering them, I would say, or just like repeatedly showing them how they could get into the test automation thing. So um, uh, a lot of the times it's just showing them the benefits of of how this work goes, and it's it's pretty vague how I'm explaining it now, but one example is in this startup, one of the front end engineers, he would never really write any tests, and I would constantly remind him to do it, but he often said that either he didn't have any time and eventually he didn't understand it. So I paired with him a little bit, and it was still a little bit difficult to actually do that. And I think like just over time, I didn't do anything specific, but over time, I remember uh we were at a meeting and then he mentioned that he did write some tests over something that he was doing, and for some reason like he said, like he literally said that a light bulb just clicked in his head, and like from that moment on he just started writing more tests than that. So it all depends on the type of developer. I've had developers who, no matter what you do, they just won't do any testing at all. They just leave it to QA. And then there's others where you kind of just like to over time, you just have to just keep helping them and showing them how this can benefit their work. And over time, a lot of the developers, they really just didn't have any prior experience to it. And once they see somebody doing it, then they start getting into it a little bit more. So it's all it all depends on the person. So there's no really like one size fits all solution to this, unfortunately. But at least my strategy, that's kind of how it worked. It was just like reminding them through the code reviews and being able to help them through that, and them being able to see that when they started adding the tests that they were actually able to work a lot faster because they had that quality baked in already. So over time it did help them a lot. just getting that experience.
That makes absolutely sense. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Then maybe a small one from my side. You mentioned you always got to asking the people you were doing code review for, where are the tests?
Yeah.
Was it always more like give me the test, or were you also suggesting in the code review or adding them yourself or anything like that, or how was that process?
No, it was very gentle. I'm not the type of person who's like just like starts angrily yelling at them or anything. But but yes, but even though that picture that I showed probably made you think that way, but not really. It was mostly just through code reviews. I would probably just leave a comment saying that this would be a good place for some tests, or in some cases I would actually like pair with them if I had the opportunity to actually write the tests. In one or two cases I would actually on GitHub in the code review I would leave like a suggested test, that like kind of like a starter test for them.
Yeah. Nice.
So it was kind of like they were still doing the work. I didn't want to do the work for them. Like that was the main thing that I didn't want to do. I didn't want to like jump in because, as I mentioned, I could do all the work, but then if I wasn't there, nobody would be
Yep.
doing the work. So my intention was to always give them, you know, kind of like the expression, like teach a man to fish and all that other stuff.
Nice.
So, so that was kind of like my intent behind it. So I was kind of gentle. I would always leave comments, but I would never block their review or anything like that. So if I saw that they had missing tests, but everything else looked great, I would just say like, you know, looks good to me, looks good to merge, but this area would have would benefit from some automated testing. So eventually over time they start doing it because I think I annoy them too much. But
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we are running out of time. If there are no other questions, I would say we hand it back to Diego. All right. Thanks, Dennis. Amazing talk.
Thank you.
Good stuff.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Dennis, for being here. I think it was a great talk. Many things were really like a huge lot of information, usable information that many people found interesting. I was checking the numbers of the people who joined, and like almost like no one left during
Good.
the complete presentation. So I'm gonna steal the presentation, so the presenting, and
Yes, there we go.
yeah. So there we go. So thanks again for that. We're gonna start wrapping up the event. Before doing that, I just want to share that in about 1 month, on the 24th of July, we're gonna have Natalia, who's gonna share with us the experience they had about mixing quality and speed, how to enable teams to scale up this automation in testing. So they call it quality assistance model. So looking forward to see you all for this next event we're gonna have in a bit less than a month. And before leaving, please check again continuous testing meetup. If you have any comments, any feedback, use the meetup.com group that you use to sign up for the event. We also look forward to see you in the Slack workspace that we have for the meetup. If you want to connect to Dennis or use one of the social media links that he was sharing. And yeah, thank you for being here, and looking forward to see you the next time. Thank you.